I'm joined today by journalist and author Ross Clark. Ross, welcome.
Hello, Douglas. Hi.
It's great to be joined by a fellow Brit. I'm talking to you from Mississippi, but you're in the UK and you've written a rather interesting book about net zero. It's called Not Zero.
Yes, not zero, how an irrational target will impoverish you, help China, and won't even save the planet.
There's a cheerful thought. Why is for a start, what is net zero by 2050? There's this target the British government has set for the UK. What exactly does it mean?
Well, it means trying to get Britain to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. It's a legally binding target. There's only 17 countries in the world have set themselves such a target. And I mean, it has vast implications for both for the sort of UK energy supply, but also for steel, cement, and agriculture, and many things. I don't think. Thing is that this was sort of nodded through Parliament in 2019 without even a vote, or not a vote in the House of Commons, the lower house of Parliament. But nobody, neither the MPs who nodded it through, had any idea what it would cost, nor how the government was going to achieve it. And they still don't have any idea how they're going to achieve it, which I think if you're going to put a legally binding target on yourself with huge implications for the economy, you ought at least to have a very good idea of what you're going to do to achieve it.
Just talk through a little bit how we got to this point. It didn't sort of start with one sort of eureka moment. There was Ed Miliband, who was a Labour left-wing leader who advocated for this. Then a series of Conservative prime ministers and leaders, David Cameron and then Boris Johnson and Theresa May. They all kind of moved the dial towards this goal. Talk us through a bit how this came about and the sort of the consensus between the two parties in Britain about this.
Well, it started with the Climate Change Act in 2008, which was dreamed up by the then Labour government. David Miliband, it was a business of both the Miliband brothers, actually. David Miliband, he sort of was Environment Secretary when he started working on it, and he had the idea we'd cut UK carbon emissions by 60% by 2050. And then his brother sort of got into his job and decided to up that to 80% by 2050 without any real rationale why he was doing it or what that would mean in terms of costs and everything. And then in the dying days of Theresa May's government in 2019, then that was suddenly up to a target of net zero, which I mean, might sound just, oh, that's a small tweaking of this piece of legislation, but it has absolutely huge implications because we simply don't have the technology to get there at the moment. And
so you've had a series of governments that have upped the quota for emissions elimination by 2050. Why 2050? What is the logic of 2050, or is it just it's a nice round number?
That's an arbitrary date, really. I mean, it's supposedly linked to the idea that, well, if Britain did this by 2050 and other countries by very soon afterwards, we would be able to limit the rise in global temperatures by no more than 1.5 Celsius above mid-19th century levels, which is all a bit too neat for me. I mean, it's sort of modeling, isn't it? The idea that you can sort of control the Earth's temperature like a thermostat on your central heating by controlling the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But it's just sort of acquired a life of its own, and we've got to be there by 2050 or the world will end. And of course, when we committed ourselves to it in Britain, the idea was we would inspire the rest of the world to set such targets. But as I say, only 17 countries have done so. They don't include the biggest emitters. China and the US, which have shown no interest in setting themselves legally binding targets to do this.
I mean, it could be that we do make an example of ourselves as a country, us Brits, but not in the way intended. Far from being a role model, we may become an example of how not to do it. Talk us through some of the consequences that are now becoming obvious now that we've got this legally binding requirement to be a net carbon neutral, net carbon dioxide neutral country by 2050. What are some of the implications? What does it mean for keeping homes warm and being able to drive cars?
Mm-hmm. Well, the government sort of set a series of targets on its way to hopefully achieving net zero by 2050, such as completely decarbonising the electricity grid by 2035. Well, at the moment, we have quite a lot of wind turbines and solar panels, but they are, as intermittent forms of energy, they are currently balanced by gas power. So when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, we can turn up the gas. That's not necessarily the cheapest and most effective way of using gas power stations, but it does work and keeps the lights on. But exactly what happens in 2035 when the last gas power station is supposed to close, I have absolutely no idea. And I keep asking government ministers this, and they cannot tell me what happens in 2035. Likewise, we've got a target to eliminate all petrol and diesel cars by 2030 and hybrids by 2035. Again, that's sort of predicated on the idea that the cost of electric cars is going to come down very sharply and the battery technology is going to improve. Well, we're not there yet. I mean, by next year, by 2024, we were told the price of an electric car would be on a parity with a petrol one. Well, that's not even nearly the case. The electric cars are still costing half as much again as their petrol equivalent. But I think yeah, sorry.
I try and explain this to an American audience, and often I'm met with complete incredulity, but it is the case in Britain that in a few years' time, it will become illegal to sell a new internal combustion engine, a car with a gas petrol powered engine. Is that right?
That is absolutely right. And Britain's going to be rather isolated in this because the EU was going to have such a target, eliminate all internal combustion engines by 2035, but it pulled back on it due to the protests by German car makers. So in the EU has now said, well, yeah, you can have internal combustion engines after 2035 as long as they are powered by e-fuels, synthetic fuels which are manufactured rather than drilled out the ground.
Presumably this also applies to things like mowers. You won't be able to buy a grass mower to cut your lawn with a internal combustion engine in Britain in a few years' time.
No, exactly. All sort of. But what happens to commercial vehicles? That's another sort of hot potato. Electric cars sort of work on a fairly smallish scale. But if you have heavy vehicles, heavy goods vehicles, are very, very difficult to see how under existing battery technology you can electrify them. We had a big step up from lead acid batteries to lithium batteries a few years ago. Mm-hmm. Well, we would require another sort of similar step up in technology in terms of sort of power to weight ratio in order to make electric lorries and buses practical. And again, the government seems to have no idea of what happens if that breakthrough in technology doesn't occur. It's just sort of we've created this sort of hostage to fortune. We're now sort of utterly reliant on technologies magically appearing just because we want them to.
If you create a legal requirement that bans the sale of cars with internal combustion engines, makes it impossible for hauliers and truckers to carry heavy goods around the country, if you pass laws that in effect make it impossible for people to heat their homes because natural gas powered heating becomes illegal, at some point you're going to get, no pun intended, a car crash. Not that there would be a car crash because cars won't be functioning. But at some point, you're going to get an almighty political reckoning. How do you think this is going to unfold? At what point do you think the political class are going to say, do you know what, this is an intellectual cul-de-sac. This is an absurdity. We need to change course.
Well, the closer we get to 2050, the clearer it will become that this is an impossible target to reach, at least without sort of, multiple magical technological breakthroughs, which we don't have at the moment. So, the government's already falling behind its target. It was hoping to install 600,000 heat pumps a year in British homes by 2026. Well, last year it was 55,000. It's not even a tenth on the way to hitting its targets for sort of decarbonising homes. But I think the very worst aspect of this is that the target, it applies only to territorial emissions. These are carbon emissions physically spewed out within Britain. It excludes emissions from factories in China which are producing goods for UK consumers, excludes agriculture in other parts of the world producing food for UK consumers. And what the government's done by putting itself under this net zero target is given itself a very perverse incentive to export our remaining manufacturing industry, export our agriculture, just in order to reach its target, with to no benefit of the planet, of course, because the emissions would still be going on elsewhere in the world.
So this is almost a sort of legally sanctioned platform for deindustrialization and agrarianization. It means that we're still going to consume the steel and the food that we want, but presumably at an inflated cost, because it'll now be produced by somebody on another part of the planet who isn't bound by these sorts of restrictions.
Well, absolutely. In terms of agriculture, I mean, there's a great fashion now. The government's trying to promote for rewilding the British countryside, which means taking land out of agricultural production and planting trees on it, or re-wetting it into sort of nature reserves, wetland reserves. It's all very nice, but of course what that means is that we export our food production. We've become more reliant on imports, and Britain as a country is only about 60% self-sufficient in food at the moment. Well, that's going to fall 50-40% or something. To no net benefit for the planet, but the trees that we plant on the UK farmland will be sucking carbon out the air. That'll go on, our carbon budget, and the emissions for agricultural production would have been exported. Government will pat itself on the back saying, look, we've reduced our national emissions, but all that's happened is really we've just offshored them.
So the UK is imposing this very draconian net zero legal target. It's going to have dramatic consequences on the ability of people in the UK, entrepreneurs in the UK, businesses in the UK, to generate wealth and create jobs. What percent of total man-made carbon emissions is the UK responsible for?
It's about 1% at the moment.
So in order to reduce that 1%, we're basically taking a holiday from history as far as the economy goes. What about other countries? China, you mentioned earlier, hasn't followed us. The United States hasn't, hopefully, followed the UK's example. And hopefully by reading your book, policymakers in America will realize quite why America shouldn't follow the British example. What about other countries? What about India or Japan or Korea? Are they signing up to this madness, or are they quietly opting out?
They have not set themselves legally binding targets, though. China has sort of set itself an aspiration to eliminate net carbon emissions by 2060, but Xi Jinping has made it absolutely clear that will not come at the cost of economic growth, and indeed in the short term it expects to increase carbon emissions every year up to about 2030. India has said we'll we'll try and meet net zero by 2070, but again, it's not a legally binding target. Joe Biden has, so the US has a target to halve emissions by sort of early 2030s, but it's not a law. It's not going to, no one's going to be able to sue the government for failing to achieve it. But that is exactly the case we have in Britain. Environmental groups are already suing the government, taking the government to court over things like expanding airports, building roads, because they say, it is not consistent with your net zero target for 2050. And the closer we get to 2050, well, the more environmental groups will start to win those cases, because there's no way the government can show that new roads and airports will be consistent with its target.
Now, we're talking here about catastrophic, monumental public policy failure informed by flawed analysis and flawed modeling, with a whole army of experts instructing policymakers what to do based on a series of flawed assumptions about the extent to which you can model complex variables. That sounds remarkably similar to what happened during the COVID crisis. You had a similar problem where policymakers were told by experts presiding over a model that they had to do certain things. Do you think that part of the problem here, like with the COVID epidemic, is that policymakers just lack the intellectual rigor to be able to question the assumptions that they're being fed? There's not the skepticism that they ought to have, that conservative policymakers ought to naturally have a skepticism towards people who tell them that they can engineer the world by design, or influence the global temperature by changing behavior now. Do you think there's a similarity? Do you think fundamentally this isn't just a crisis of a so-called climate hysteria, but it's actually a sort of fundamental intellectual failure of Britain's governing elite to actually understand how the world works and exhibit sufficient skepticism when told they have to do something?
Well, very few of our MPs and ministers have a background in science or engineering, and it shows them that they lack the confidence to ask the right questions when faced with people sort of shoving graphs under their noses, and just as it happened in COVID. And on the net zero issue, the ministers, MPs get presented with these rather black predictions saying, oh, the world's going to be underwater, and we're going to have more hurricanes and storms, and more people are going to die of the heat, and they get sort of bowled over by that. They don't sort of ask the right questions. They don't go back and read the research properly, because if they did, they would find that a lot of the claims that are popularly made by campaigners, but also a few of the scientists involved in this area, are simply not backed up by data. I mean, take, for example, the number of times I have heard that hurricanes are supposedly getting stronger and more frequent because of climate change. Well, the data simply does not back that up. If you look at what the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has said about this, it said, there has been no upward trend in landfalling hurricanes in the US since over the past 2 centuries, and it's too early to say whether there will be any increase in hurricanes due to man-made climate change. I heard John Kerry the other week went to a public lecture, and he claimed that 10 million people a year were dying of the heat. Well, when I looked this up, it comes from a study carried out by University of Monash in Australia. What it found was that 5 million people a year, not 10 million, were dying of extreme temperatures, but 9/10 out of them were deaths from extreme cold, not from deaths from extreme heat. And that's true. That was true even in Africa.
Cold is the far bigger killer.
Yeah, and the trend, while there's a slight upwards trend in deaths from the heat, there's a bigger downwards trend in deaths from the cold as the globe warms. So actually, to date, climate change actually saved lives from extreme temperatures. That would be your conclusion from the data. Yeah, it gets twisted, to mean completely the opposite, which is absolutely bizarre.
I'm slightly puzzled when I follow British websites and listen to British radio programs, and I hear members of parliament who are now ministers, who I came into parliament in 2005, and I remember them when we were first elected. People like Michael Gove in 2005 and various other people in 2010. They never had this sort of obsessive belief in saving the planet by reducing the amount of petrol that British motorists used. They never had this sort of zeal that they need to sort of, deindustrialize the economy. I'm just puzzled as to where this movement came from. The people in Parliament who espouse all this belief in reducing our emissions to net zero, they never went into politics because they believed that. It's become a sort of post-facto justification. Now that they're in office, they're either looking for something to do, or the establishment around them, the civil servants around them, the officials around them, are in effect sort of presenting this to them as a ready-made policy script. Do you think it's that? Do you think that the reason why conservative ministers, like left-wing ministers, end up going along with all of this is because it's sort of presented to them by those around them as what they have to do? Things like the Stern report. Do you think that has created such a sort of establishment orthodoxy within the administrative state in Britain that whoever you elect is basically going to go along with this nonsense?
Well, it is very sort of puzzling to work out how this has sort of erupted into the sort of issue in the way it has. And we had the Stern review, and I mean that I think at that time there was one group, the World Wildlife Fund or something, saying we had 5 years to save the planet, and then 5 years came and went, and then we have 3 years to save the planet, and another one.
I remember King Charles as Prince of Wales once said we had 12 years to save the planet.
Yeah, and it's utterly bizarre that the way this sort of fear of climate changes have been gripped. It's like a sort of virus in working its way through through our leaders. And I think the government here is very sort of driven partly by the sort of public opinion on it, because when opinion pollsters ask people, do you want to tackle climate change, everybody says yes, because that sounds the right thing to do. Yeah. But of course, when the same pollsters go back and ask people, well, are you prepared to give up your car, give up international flying holidays, or are you prepared to pay £10,000 to rip out your gas boiler and put in a heat pump? They get entirely different answers. And people want they're all in favor of the sort of vague action on climate change, but not the specifics when it comes to it. But there's also this fantasy which seems to have gripped the conservative side of the House in Britain. It's the idea that somehow net zero is going to save us money. It's going to unleash sort of such a welter of technological innovation that we'll end up with cheaper energy and cheaper ways of doing things. Well, over time, hopefully, some of these technologies will break through, but it's not happening in Britain at the moment. What's happening is that all the jobs making the wind turbines and solar panels are going to China, or they're going to the US. Biden's Inflation Reduction Act is a pretty obvious piece of protectionism, just handing out large grants to people who buy American stuff. And but as a result of that, we've got sort of manufacturers looking to transfer production from Europe to the US. And all these European countries, Britain and others, who have committed themselves to net zero, they're losing out on the sort of boom in green energy and so on, and partly because of high energy prices, which are created by the policies designed to achieve net zero. And
Now, America hasn't committed to a legally binding target. It's not as draconian as the UK in its approach, but it's not that far behind. Biden, you talked about his some of his protectionist measures, a huge amount of subsidy now being spent on trying to encourage American industry to create so-called green growth. Tell us a little bit about some of the lessons that America should learn from the UK. Tell us how far behind is America in terms of making this similar error?
well, I think the lesson of it, the prime lesson of it, is by setting yourself a target, you shackle your own industry, you impose costs on your own people, on your own taxpayers, but you do not stimulate the growth of new technologies, new industries. But you see, on the other side of the fence, you've got on the other side of the political divide, you've got people who are pushing for net zero because they see it as a vehicle to destroy capitalism. The sort of Naomi Klein types who think capitalism, is so dangerous it must be destroyed, and it's destroying the planet and so on, and who actually want to impoverish the people. That there's a movement in Britain and probably elsewhere called the degrowth movement, who actually people actually want to end economic growth because they think it'll be good for the planet. Well, that's one thing if you're a sort of middle class, somebody who's very well off and maybe traveling by train rather than plane is an interesting way of spending your holidays. But if you're actually struggling to put food on the table, struggling to keep your home warm, you don't want people saying, sorry, we're going to make you poorer in order to help the planet. So you've got these two sort of wings of the net zero movement, who's who, while they might be agreed on they want to get to net zero by 2050 or even earlier, they have just completely different conceptions of what that means and why they want to achieve it. From boosting capitalism to destroying capitalism, from making people richer to making people poorer. You cannot have the sort of net zero thing will eventually disintegrate for these reasons, because the people who are backing it at the moment are so at odds with their underlying philosophy.
Ross, thank you very much for your time. Are you getting a lot of interest in your book?
Yeah, it seems to be selling well here, and we've got lots
Fantastic.
of interest in it. People talking about it, and I think we even overtook Greta Thunberg in the Amazon rankings.
That is great. That is great to hear. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.